Welcome to this session on web services. In this session, we'd like to talk about both types of web services, SOAP web services and RESTful web services. And we'll look at how we can consume SOAP as well as expose it, and we'll talk a little bit about SOAP endpoints. And then we'll also look at REST from consuming a single REST method and how to use some of the callbacks to consuming a whole REST API, and then also look at how we can expose a RESTful service. And we'll also talk a little bit about how we can see how these services are working by checking the logs and doing some logging if we're providing those services. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we just think about web services from a high level, web services are a set of functionality offered by some software system over the web. And typically these are provided in a language agnostic way. So they're remote procedures and we make the request and then we get back some sort of response. How the implementation of that service is provided, we don't necessarily know and we don't necessarily need to care. But this allows the integration between many different types of heterogeneous services and systems. So we can have different services calling each other and those systems can interact in different ways. OutSystems tries to simplify both consuming and exposing that functionality through either the SOAP web services or RESTful web services. So a lot of times we refer to these as SOAP web services and RESTful APIs, but OutSystems makes it easy to consume and expose both of those. So when we think about SOAP, SOAP has a very formalized contract, and that contract is described in a web services description language, or what is sometimes referred to as a WSDL file. And that WSDL file describes all of the operations, their input parameters, their return types, everything is fully described. And they have a tendency, if they need to be, very detailed as far as the contract and the information. And all of the requests and responses in SOAP web services are sent back and forth using XML. RESTful web services, on the other hand, are generally lightweight and they're an alternative to the SOAP web services. They don't have to have any formal API contract file to start, but they can provide documentation and examples instead of a formalized contract. And inside of REST, the requests and responses are usually sent back and forth in compact JSON notation. So that's JavaScript object notation, which is a fairly simple and easy way to describe the different requests and responses. So if we look at each of these in a little bit more detail, we'll start with SOAP. And if we wanted to consume one or more methods that are part of a SOAP version 1.1 or 1.2 service, then there are a couple things that we would have to do. The first thing we'd want to do is say that yes, we're going to go ahead and consume a SOAP web service. So we would go to the Logic tab under Integrations, right-click on SOAP and go ahead and say Consume SOAP web service. And from there, we'd have to describe where the WSDL file is going to be for the service that we're going to be consuming. And once we provide the URL of the WSDL file to go ahead and do that, it will ask us what type of binding this file should have, whether it's a regular binding or a SOAP 1.2 binding. And those are just two different versions, which are slightly different, 1.2 being a little more updated or adding more types of features and capabilities inside of it. Once we describe what the bindings are for that particular type of web service, it then will ask us which of the methods that might be on that external web service that we're interested in consuming. And we could either consume all of them or we could go ahead and consume one of them specifically, or a few. It didn't really matter the number. From there, we could go ahead and use those SOAP methods, because what OutSystems is going to do once we've defined the information in the previous screens is it will generate methods for those SOAP operations as server actions. And because those server actions will need to hold different types of data that were described in the SOAP web service, it will also create any compound data structures as OutSystem structures. So over here, we can see that once we've imported something like the country info web service, it has a number of different methods that we could call. Those methods might have inputs and outputs, and those inputs and outputs can be described inside of a group of structures that are part of the definition of that service that was created. So all of those generated elements can be used just like we would any other OutSystems action or structure. It's also possible to change the default values of any of the input parameters and any of the names or descriptions of the elements that might exist inside of the structures. And we can refresh these to go ahead and get any service updates that might occur when we're trying to consume these different types of methods. Now, if we can consume SOAP relatively easy, which is nice, we also might wish to expose a service that we have inside of OutSystems as a SOAP web service. Now, to be able to do that, we just need to create the service, create the method, and then implement those methods as actions. So to create the service, we again go to SOAP, but in this time instead of right-clicking and saying consume, we would say we wish to expose a web service. And from there, we would have to give that web service a name and then add a web service method to it. And once we give that web service method a name, then it is just an action flow, like any other action flow, so we would implement it in the same way. And here you can see our SOAP web service has its own set of properties, and some of those properties deal with security and whether we can access it internally or not. But exposing a capability inside of OutSystems as a SOAP web service is as simple as these 3 steps, which is really nice. Now, once those SOAP web services are created, the endpoint information of the exposed web service is available inside of Service Center. So you could go look up its endpoint by looking in the Modules Integration tab, and then you would find where that is. You can also just think about it because it follows the same pattern, and that pattern is that the endpoint and WSDL URLs are the host name with the module name and the web service name. So here you can see the host name of our server, the module name that we were working inside of, the web service name inside that module, and when our web services get generated, they are .asmx files from the .NET code that got generated. And if we wish to make the WSDL available, it's providing the WSDL as a parameter after the question mark. If people want to use the actual web service, they just call the ASMX file directly. So the web service is exposed with a WSDL, and depending on how we defined it, they can go ahead and load the SOAP 1.1 or the SOAP 1.2 binding. So that's it for SOAP. We also have RESTful APIs. And in the RESTful APIs, we can go ahead and consume a single REST method that might be part of a larger set of APIs. So how would we do that inside of OutSystems? Well, we'd want to provide the method's URL and its location, and then run some sort of test to make sure that we can call that and get the response back and then work with it. So the way we would do that is we would go to the integrations area of the logic tab. We would right-click on REST and ask it to consume a REST API. From there, we'll be asked the question, do you want to just use one of the methods of this API, or would you like to use all of the methods of the API? So we'll talk about all the methods in just a second, but if we look at using a single method, then what we would do is go get the URL of that API and then be able to call the specific method that we need. So we would use its URL, and we would go ahead and set the right method for that particular type of URL. And once this was ready, if there were any parameters, we could go ahead and add those parameters, but then we click the test button. And once we click the test button, down in the response below, we'll get some sort of response from that server. In this case, we got a successful 200 OK response with a structure of JSON that's showing us the information coming back from this particular type of RESTful API. What we'd want to do once it's here is tell it to copy that to the response body. So here we're just running a test, and we could have changed the headers or the authentication information. We also have a body of the request. If we actually copy this to the body, then this will become part of the definition of what this REST method is going to be. And once we're done with that, if we click OK, then very similar to the way everything got generated for the SOAP web services, the same thing. OutSystems generates that RESTful method as an action, and then it also sets up any of the data types as structures. So the generated elements will be able to be used just like any other action or structure that we've talked about before. So here we can see that if we were trying to call the movie database and we were just asking for the getMovie method that's part of that RESTful API, it has its inputs. We know what the output's going to be, and the structures are defined. And those structures exist because those structures were generated by OutSystems as part of the import or consuming part of the process where we were trying to figure all of that out. Now, once that exists, it is possible to go back in and change it. So we can change the default values of any of the input parameters. We could change the name and the description of elements, and we can change data types of the attributes and parameters that are coming in, and we can also remove some of them. So we could add more or remove some. The reason these capabilities are here inside of the RESTful side and they weren't really seen inside of the web services side is because the web services has the WSDL file, and that interaction for the methods, those are sort of strongly typed and we know exactly what those are. Here, because we just called a particular URL and we got an example, if I go back to the previous slide and we look at it real quickly, all I got is some text. So JSON is just giving me a description that it should be a page with a number 1 and the total results, which are 77. So OutSystems, when generating the structures for these responses, will try to make intelligent guesses about what those data types are. But occasionally the example that we're using may not have the correct type of data type. So it may require us to go back in and update that just to make sure all of this works a little bit more efficiently. Now, there are 2 extra things in REST as well. There are some RESTful callbacks, which means that the RESTful service provides a chance before we actually make the request, and then when we call the service, when we get the response back, we have 2 opportunities to go ahead and do something. So we can change the things we're going to send before we make the request, and then on after response is what it sounds like. When the response comes back, we could alter that. These actions will automatically be created as part of the overall life cycle for a REST method call. So here we can see the definition of the RESTful API that we have. We know that when it gets called, in this particular case, there's nothing in the on before request, but in on after response, we can create an on after response action, and then that action could do something in an action flow. And it may be that when the response comes back from the RESTful API, that the types that are there aren't the types that we want, or that we need to change some of the values, and we can go ahead and customize the response on the way back. So we can take the response that we're getting and customize it, and we could say that depending on what's sent in, we change the response code or do something else with it. So sometimes these are very useful, excuse me, just to be able to go ahead and debug the customized requests and figure out what's happening when we're interacting with a service. It also allows us to go ahead and alter any of the return values or change something that's going to be sent to the external service. And we can do that without necessarily having to change anything that was auto-generated. So that makes things a little bit simpler. Now, sometimes we wish to not just consume one method of a RESTful API, but we want to consume all of the methods. And in that case, we just need to find the API URL. And typically when that occurs, there is a Swagger specification that someone will give us, that the service provider, RESTful service provider, would make available. So if we're looking for a RESTful API and they're providing some sort of documentation or information, if it's not inside of the Swagger specification, we won't be able to automatically generate all the methods. So how would we do this from Service Studio? Again, we'd go to Logic and Integrations, right-click on REST and say Consume the REST API. And then in this case, we would say we're going to consume all of the methods of the API. And there, we just need to go ahead and specify where we can find the definition of the API and many times that's described as a swagger.json. So once that's there, then we're able to use all of the methods and the pieces just like we were able to use everything when we did the single method. So none of that changes. Now, when we're going to expose something inside of OutSystems as a RESTful service, to expose it as a RESTful service, we need to create the service and the method, and then implement everything as an action. So if this sounds very similar to how we did it with web services, it is the exact same process. So what we would do is come in integrations, right-click and say we wish to expose a REST API. Once we've named our RESTful service or RESTful API, we can then add a method to it. And then once we add that method, we would just implement that method as a normal action. And then we could also specify some of the information about the RESTful service. So we could say whether or not it should be documented, if we're going to send all of the default values. So some of the security and advanced settings are available here as well. So once we have the ability to both produce and consume all of these services, whether they're web services or RESTful services, we may need some information about how they're being used. So Service Center will log information about both what's been generated, what's available, and how they're being used. So inside of Service Center, if we go to the factory, we can go inside of the eSpaces area, which is the module area, and if we looked for the modules, we could go ahead and find our module, and if we looked inside of our module, we'd be able to find under Integrations tab all of the exposed web services, the consumed web services, the exposed RESTful APIs, and the consumed RESTful APIs. And there are some details here about all of these. Things like what is the effective endpoint or URL that we're calling or that we've produced and are exposing. What type of security are we using, and is there any certificate that's needed? And here's where we can define the logging level. So when we're interacting with these services, how robust or verbose should those logs be so that when something goes wrong or something's happening, we can get as much information as possible. So we could keep it as the default level, and then we could go ahead and modify that level depending on the types of logging that we need. But all of the configuration here is done on the module level. So you would find your particular module that you've built and look for the integration tab in that module. And then last but not least, as we're monitoring people using these web services, if we go under monitoring to integrations, the integration log will hold all of the information about the different services that are being called and whether they've been provided or they're being consumed. In this case, it's showing, a big log for the Google APIs that we're using, and those happen to be REST APIs that we're consuming. We can see that set of information, and everything looks to be going back and forth very well with the server that we're communicating. And earlier there were some errors, and if we wanted to find out more about that error, we could click on the error and get the details, just like we can in other logs. So we covered a lot about web services. The fact that there are SOAP services and how to consume and expose them. We also talked about RESTful services and that we can consume an individual or a single RESTful API or a whole set of APIs, and that they have extra callbacks to help us do some of the extra work. And there's also the ability for us to expose the RESTful services and check the logs whenever we need them. So that's it for this session on web services. Thanks for listening.